Hello and welcome to this video lesson for the poem War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. I'm going to start by looking at the background information for the poem, read it, then make sure we understand it, then go into deeper analysis ideas for themes. What we'll start with is some background information. So Carol Ann Duffy wrote this poem in 1985. Duffy's known for creating unique and troubled characters in her poetry, something that we definitely see in this one. Now, she was inspired to write this poem by her friendship with a war photographer. A war photographer is exactly what it sounds like. It's someone whose job it is to go out to conflicts and to document what they see. So in papers, when we see in newspapers and on websites, evidence of what's going on in conflicts and in war, it's because of these photographers. They put their lives on the line to get this footage for their job. So she was especially intrigued by the peculiar challenge faced by these people whose job requires them to record terrible, horrific events without being able to directly help their subjects. So war photographers use photography to convey certain truths about the human condition. Remember, human condition is an important phrase. It's basically what it's saying about life, what it's saying about humanity. And that's just like how poets use language and words to do the same job. So they're both exploring things about what humanity is like, what we're learning about humans. Throughout the poem, Duffy provokes us, so kind of makes us consider our own response when confronted with the photographs that we regularly see in our newspaper supplements, and why so many of us have become desensitized to these images. Desensitized just means over time it's stopped having an effect. So by viewing this issue from the perspective of a photographer, she also reveals the difficulties of such an occupation. By the end of the poem, it is clear that her subject, so the character, the war photographer, straddles two vastly different worlds. So we've got the away, the conflict, the war-torn countries, and the home, which is back here in England. Increasingly, though, this war photographer feels like he doesn't belong to either of them. So this is our main setting for the poem. It does have flashbacks, but mostly it's set in his darkroom. Now, a darkroom looks something like this image. It would be dark, obviously, but then there's a red light to help the film develop. Developing is when the film is, it starts to become clearer, starts to reveal itself, like in these. And then they would be rolled up in spools. Spools are these kind of cylindrical things here, which are just rolls of film. So I'm going to have a read of the poem now, and then afterwards I'll go through it a little bit slower to make sure we understand. War photographer. In his darkroom, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he, a priest, preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So let's go through the poem a little bit slower now. So we know then that in terms of where it is, he's in his dark room. He's clearly returned from his job. His dark room could be at home or it could be at work. And he's handling spools of suffering. So he's organizing and developing the film from his travels. And when he's handling them, Duffy compares him to a priest preparing to intone a mass. So the atmosphere is very solemn, very serious, and he's slow and careful, like a priest about to deliver a speech. That's what mass is. And then we've got a series of famous locations around the world where there have been conflicts and where the war photographer's clearly been. Belfast, Northern Ireland, Beirut in Lebanon, Phnom Penh is in Cambodia. And the stanza ends with all flesh is grass. It's a bit of a metaphor here. So is Duffy saying that, like grass, life is temporary, fragile? Or is she saying that the bodies in these places were covering the floor in such a widespread way it was like grass? Could be either. Next, he has a job to do. And this is really important. This line simplifies and justifies his behavior. Everything he does and every way that he behaves is because he has a job to do. It is his job to do that. He must be professional. And that's something that definitely trails throughout the rest of the poem. His hands didn't tremble when he was on the job, but they seem to now. So what we learn from that is, again, this sense of professionalism. He seems to struggle with what he's seen when he returns home, but when he's actually seeing it, he doesn't. The rest of the stanza is then making comparisons about his home and where he was on his job. He's back home in rural England, so the kind of countryside. He's home again. But now he's home, he's noticing differences, novelties between what life is like here and what life is like away. So, for example, the fields don't explode here. Next stanza. Something is happening. So we've got a progression in the story then. So he's in his dark room and he's organizing the spools, and now something is happening to the film. So it's developing. He can see shapes starting to appear, and he sees a stranger's features, and the whole stanza focuses on one of these images, really. He sees a photo of a dead man that he took, and it prompts him to remember when he took it, and he had to look into his wife's eyes, this poor man's wife's eyes, to seek approval before he did it. So she was crying out for him, and he had to look at her for kind of a permission to take this photo. There was nothing else he could do. So we've got the sense here that this character, this war photographer, is really struggling with the morality and the complete lack of control that is brought by this job. And it says, without words, to do what someone must. So there is a sense here that it's required of him. He's got to do it. Someone has to take these images. So, final stanza. The kind of tragic thing about this poem is that obviously we've seen through flashbacks and memories that it's a terrible occupation and it requires a hell of a lot of resilience. But only 5 or 6 of them get picked out for Sunday's supplement. So a supplement is kind of like an additional pull-out part of the paper. And in this part where it says 100 agonies in black and white from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6, what that's saying is that the war photographer is going to develop all of these images, countless images of death, extreme suffering, misery, but the editor will only pick out a tiny fraction of them to actually use. So all of these people have been photographed when they've died, probably for nothing. So it's another meaningless that they died for no reason, and now these photos were taken for no reason. And we've got a little bit of criticism here from Duffy in the next few lines. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. When it says prick, the eyeballs prick, it's that kind of little sensation that you get when you're about to cry that it's referencing there. And that's really key, about to cry. It's this sense that we do have this tiny moment of sadness when we see these images. We feel very briefly terrible about it, but then we get on with the rest of our lives. Between the bath and pre-lunch beers, so we become desensitized to it, recognizing, oh, that's sad, but then we'll move on. And then the poem ends. From the airplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Um, so the poem ends basically with him going back out again for his next job to capture more from another conflict. And there will always be conflict. There will always be somewhere for him to go to take these photos. Again, another criticism. When it says impassively means emotionless. So basically, he's looking blankly. So has he returned to his hardened professional version of himself, or is he actually very damaged and he's just become numb? So open to interpretation. And then they do not care. The pronoun they is left deliberately ambiguous. We talked about this in other poems before, the idea of ambiguity. When it says they do not care, who does that mean? Is it the readers? Is it his colleagues and his editor? Is it the whole world? There's no answer to it. I think what Duffy wants is for you to come up with your own interpretation of that. So now we've dealt with the who, what, where, when, we're going to deal with the why. So why has this poem been made? What is it saying about the human condition? What is it saying about life? What is it saying about nature, human nature? So it is another example of detachment brought by conflict. By detachment, I mean this character, this war photographer, doesn't seem to feel part of anyone, of anything. He doesn't feel like he's part of anywhere. So he's detached from society because of this job, which requires him to go and spend time with people abroad, but then he may well see them die. He may well see them already suffering because their relatives have died. And then he comes home and he has to still live with these memories because of his photographs. And therefore, we see psychological effects on those involved in war as well. He's definitely struggling, something we'll go into more when we look at themes. There are more untold tragedies in this poem, again, about the civilians in war. So, civilians and how they suffer during war. This is a new perspective of it. It is definitely a criticism of how we can become desensitized to the experiences of others, especially in the final stanza. And then finally, it's another exploration of the horrors of war, this time from the perspective of someone whose occupation relies on it, which is quite an interesting twist, especially if we compare it to poems like Poppies. So let's move on to themes then. So remember, a theme is a big recurring idea throughout a text. And I think that one big idea throughout this poem, just like many other poems, is identity, the idea of who he is as a war photographer. What is his role? How does that shape who he has become? What kind of a person is he now? Instead of going too far into that, because I think it's such a big theme, I've kind of interwoven it into these three: memories, conflict, and trauma. So let's start off with memories. Memories are clearly very important in this poem, something that the war photographer can't really escape, because even if he did somehow manage to achieve it psychologically, he's still got the physical evidence of it in front of him when he's developing the film. So, rural England, home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel. So here we've got the use of caesura when it goes rural England, full stop, home again. Remember, caesura is a break within a line. And what caesura does is it emphasizes what comes before it, because we have to stop. So the use of caesura here helps emphasize how much rural England contrasts with the horrors of the other locations in the poem. You'll remember that earlier it said Beirut, Belfast, Phnom Penh. And so it's once again that contrast of places. So yes, he has escaped to safety, but he can't escape his memories, because he's home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. So what does ordinary mean when it says ordinary pain? Well, maybe stress or illness. That's quite ordinary, isn't it? We all go through that. Again, these are contrasting against the horrific pain that he's been seeing. And it says that simple weather can dispel. So trivial pain like stress or illness can often be made better by good weather. Our problems are pretty much relatively minute then in comparison. Later, a stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. So we've got the fact that the speaker calls the man in this image a stranger. Stranger seems impersonal, but that's all that this man's body was. It was a nameless victim of conflict, and there are countless victims of conflict who are nameless, especially to this photographer. The photographer will never know that person. They'll never have the opportunity to get to know that person. And that must be a huge proportion of their jobs, to see these bodies of people that they will never know because they will never be able to. And it's interesting how the speaker says the stranger's features twist. Features could represent any part of their body. It could also represent damage done to their body. And twist could convey the gruesome and painful way that this man must have died. It could be about how his body is kind of disfigured or contorted in death. And so that's scarred into the photographer's memory. Then it's called a half-formed ghost, and there's a couple of potential reasons for this. First of all, you could say that the film hasn't finished developing yet, which gives it the appearance of being like a ghost. And then the metaphor version of it is it because this image is haunting the photographer, hence half-formed ghost? Then we've got, he remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. And an interesting part of this is how it says he remembers the cries. So we've already had that he's got visual cues with the actual photographs, but there's also here the sign that he remembers sounds, so auditory flashbacks. So we've got the use of sensory imagery here to show how vivid these memories are. They're very strong and powerful flashbacks. He can remember the cries of this man's wife who had just lost her husband. He also remembers having to take the photo and the situation that he was in, where he had to look at this man's wife for this approval. There's a sense of shame here, which contrasts against the duty that he had as a war photographer. And then we've got the blood stained into foreign dust. So the verb stained firstly reflects the gruesome images he had to see, but it could also refer to how they are stained in his mind permanently. So literally, the blood was stained into the foreign dust, so it conveys the gruesome image. But because stained conveys permanence, the idea of being permanent, you could say that it's also stained in his mind. And then in the last stanza, 100 agonies in black and white, the speaker calls the photographs 100 agonies. And agony just means extreme pain. So another example then this of just like spools of suffering, of how much pain the photographer saw and remembers. The phrase just reduces all of these people's lives into pure suffering. It's suffering itself. And then we've got the fact that they're in black and white. The use of color imagery here, reducing their lives to simple images that appear on newspapers. They might not even be viewed across the world. Their whole lives have been lived, then ended, then photographs have been taken of them, and all of that might not even be seen. It might just be meaningless. It's conveying this huge tragedy of conflict and war. Speaking of which, let's move on to conflict then. Let's see how Duffy has presented the idea of conflict and what it does to people, what it brings for people. In the first stanza, we have this list: Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. So what we've got here is the use of caesura again, because we've got pauses within lines. We've got the full stops breaking up Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. Then we've got the end stop at the end of the line as well. So what it's doing here is listing different locations which have been affected by conflicts. They're all part of his past. So the caesura makes them sound like a list: Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. And the effect of the caesura then is that it sounds like the list could just go on and on and on. There's no stopping. There's no end to this list of where there have been conflicts. And then we've got all flesh is grass. We're going to go into this a little bit more. So horribly graphic choice of noun for starters. All flesh is grass. When we hear the word flesh, it connotes exposed flesh. So cuts and damage to skin, muscle, torn flesh, all that kind of stuff. So flesh implies damage. It implies pain. So the wider metaphor at play here, though, is that it could refer to how delicate and fragile we are as humans. As I said before, just like grass, is it comparing us to grass because it's and it is very delicate, very fragile. Alternatively, though, are the bodies on the floor so widespread that the speaker is comparing them to grass? It's definitely a possibility as well. Very gruesome imagery then. So, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So, the important word on this first line is which don't explode beneath the feet. This is an important word because the idea of fields being simply peaceful and beautiful has become like a novelty to the photographer. He's used to them being used as locations for mines. So, he's noticing these differences between cultures, between countries. Running children, so the reference to innocence, the innocence of youth and children, makes this tragedy even more emotive. The complete helplessness of children, and also how they are completely blameless, and they would have had all of their lives to live. Again, referencing this tragedy, the horrors of war. In a nightmare heat. So if we think about what nightmares actually are, they represent our worst fears. So here Duffy is using the phrase nightmare heat to represent how some of these war-torn countries are basically like hell itself, something that we find very difficult to imagine here. And then finally, in this section, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Um, we've talked about this word briefly before. The reader's eyeballs prick. Now, so it's just that very quick sensation that you get in your eyes when you're about to cry, and that's really important, as I've said before, because it doesn't go through, it doesn't continue, it doesn't go beyond this sensation. Duffy also, in the next line, references relatively luxurious activities like being able to bathe and drink casually to contrast against the lives of those who have been lost in conflict. It's also a representation of how easily we forget about the suffering due to our own comforts. Things like bathing and having drinks, pre-lunch beers, things that we maybe take for granted here. They're not in a lot of countries. That's not an option. And then the ending of the poem, from the fact that he gets back onto a plane and the whole process is over and he's back out to get more photographs, that helps convey the idea that conflicts never end. And then back to the pronoun they and they do not care. So yeah, we've got the ambiguous word. It is ambiguous, and that helps convey the lack of consideration that the general public gives to the horrors experienced by the victims of conflict. So it's not just about look how terrible these events are. It's not just about look how horrible the lives of these people are. It's look at how we don't seem to actually care. We don't seem to actually do anything about it. We often forget how some people are out there right now suffering terribly. And that leads us on to the idea of trauma. It's not just the people that he sees who have undergone trauma. He himself, as the war photographer, has experienced trauma. So suffering, his mental suffering, his psychological suffering. The poem begins with, in his dark room, he is finally alone. And there's a very interesting choice of word here, finally. Finally implies that he was desperate for it, that he couldn't wait to be on his own. It's a relief. Is this because of how traumatic his experiences have been with other people? So when he's been with other people and he's been watching them die or crying out for the loss of their loved ones, I guess it would be a relief to finally be on your own, to not be around others. You could also say that the dark room, obviously, is literal. It's where he's developing his film. You could also say it's metaphorical for his memory itself. When things are calm and dark and reddened, he sees flashbacks of the horrors of war. You could take that outside of the dark room and say that this is permanently with him. His hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So when we tremble, we associate that verb with fear and nerves. So he's psychologically damaged, and that affects him physically. So physically, his body is reacting to his nerves. Now, it's interesting that it says did not tremble then. Back to the idea of professionalism then. He's so professional that it doesn't affect his performance. But then when he comes home, we see that changes. Still on the idea of then, it relates to he has a job to do. And it's interesting that he has a job to do ends with a full stop in the middle of the line. So the caesura. So she's emphasizing here, Duffy, that the photographer has a resilience to continue what he is doing, despite it affecting him mentally. That's very similar to soldiers, how they continue to serve despite the terrible things that they have to go through. So, which did not seem to tremble then, but seem to now. Um, but when he's home, the trembling actually returns. So his body's no longer performing for the sake of his job. So the cracks start to appear. And so we learn that this character, this war photographer, is someone who is struggling. Even though he doesn't show it on the job, the cracks start to appear when he isn't. So from the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. So this is the end of the poem. So stares, the verb stares, he's staring out from this plane. And what it does is it conveys a sense of sadness from him, maybe even reluctance to go back. But even if you don't agree with those, you've got to concede that at the very least, he doesn't seem to enjoy what he does. It's a job that he does almost out of duty. It's not something that he would get pleasure out of. And he's staring impassively. So this adverb, impassively, means that he was looking without any expression. He was blank, maybe showing how drained or jaded he's become. The job, then, and the things that he has to see clearly take a toll on him. They clearly affect him and drain him. And so that's what the poem's about, an exploration of several things. First of all, him as a character, as a war photographer, how he can live with what he has to do, with what he has to see, and how he's maybe struggling to live with that. But also the poem's a criticism of how we live in such comfort and perhaps don't pay enough attention to how there are others out there in the world who are suffering terribly. And it's people like the war photographer who will know more about that than most. So I hope you found that helpful. As with all the other poems, there were lots of things that I didn't get to explore today. If you wanted to explore it further, we've got the English Revision Drive, you've got your teachers, and then these really useful websites, especially genius.com. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for listening.